Greetings, everyone. My name is Munir Sheikh. I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Bayan Islamic Graduate School, and it's a pleasure to be one of the moderators for today's session on addressing the misuse of sacred texts, and particularly in terms of how that misuse could potentially fuel anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Of course, this is a topic of great concern to many of us in the interfaith community. I want to start off by acknowledging and thanking our convener, Ms. Seema Ali. Seema is the founding president and director of an organization or initiative called Community Nexus. She's committed to advocating for community building within the interfaith community of Southern California. She currently serves as the president of the South Coast Interfaith Council, and she, as I mentioned, is the founder of the Interfaith Task Force and Community Nexus. So thank you, Seema, for your initiative and your great passion and concern for developing opportunities for our faith communities to hear one another, to empathize with one another, and to learn from one another, even in the midst of tremendous tragedy and challenge that we see in the world today. So I just wanted to offer my thanks to you, and I would like to invite my co-moderator, Andrea Hodos, to say a word as well.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. Sacred text from both Judaism and Islam are often misused and misinterpreted, both within each of our traditions and by people of other faiths. And this is done in ways sometimes that promotes hate, division, and violence, despite the overarching themes of peace and unity that the scriptures, that both of our scriptures often convey. It is through the lens of these scriptures that we can better understand the complex dynamics of how peace and violence are framed, distorted, and weaponized to justify prejudice. And this is something that I, as the Associate Director of New Ground, Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, am just very grateful to have the opportunity to talk about with two really incredible scholars who understand both of our traditions with a great deal of depth.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be working with you. So as we've indicated, the idea behind this particular session is to really sustain meaningful conversation and engagement across our communities, recognizing that our communities are quite diverse and have different kinds of alignments across race, gender, ethnicity, and of course political ideologies. But we share in the common concern about xenophobia and racism that can impact our communities and other communities. So we're really looking forward to hearing from our two scholars today who will be addressing this issue and providing us with some insights into how various texts can be used and misused, as we've intimated. So the structure for today is we're going to be hearing from each of our panelists one at a time. We'll have Dr. Firestone going first, and then we will hear from Professor Afridi. And then we'll have some time for audience Q&A. We will take note of any questions that you put in the chat, and we will identify them and prioritize them for offering to our panelists to discuss. And then we will also invite a number of our graduate students or students at various institutions to offer some reflections and thoughts on what they've heard from our professors, and then we'll conclude, inshallah. So that's the plan, and I'll turn it back over to Andrea for a few more remarks before we get started.
So we're going to ask all of us to really consider several community agreements, whether you're asking questions or, again, once you're a student panelist. So I will let everyone know what they are now and then reiterate them when we start with our students. First, we want everyone to be assuming good intentions, both from our teachers and from panelists. If you are speaking, whether that's in a question or whether that's as a panelist, we ask that you speak only for yourself and from your own experiences. We ask that when I'm going to say when, because there in these conversations are always going to be moments of discomfort. When you have that feeling of discomfort, I invite you to take a good deep breath and turn to wonder first. Wonder about what's happening. Hold some curiosity. It is the place from which you may be able to expand your perspective. And then you can name your discomfort, again, doing that from your own perspectives and your own experiences.
All right, so let me just introduce our speakers for today, and then we'll get started. Uh, so Dr. Rabbi Ruvain Firestone is the Regenstein Professor in Medieval Judaism and Islam at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, where he has served since 1993. He founded the Center for Muslim-Jewish Engagement, or CMJE, a Hebrew Union College joint program with the Omar Ibn al-Khattab Foundation in Los Angeles. And he's also involved with the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at the University of Southern California. Dr. Mehnaz Afridi is a professor of religious studies and director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College in New York. She specializes in courses on Islam, the Holocaust, genocide, comparative religion, and feminism. Her acclaimed book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, published in 2017, was nominated for prestigious awards, including the Yad Vashem International Book Prize. I want to have a warm and hearty welcome to both of our scholars. Thank you for making the time to be with us and to share in this important initiative to broaden the conversation and bring our communities together in better understanding.
Thank you, Munir. So Mehnaz and I are going to begin with a little conversation about who we are, where we're coming from. I guess I'm going to start out because I butted in early on. And I want to begin just by saying that this is in this particular moment in history, this is a pretty extraordinary thing that we're talking to one another at a time when there's such anger, resentment, and disappointment between our two communities now. We don't even have to say much more about this. This is not the topic of our discussion today, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge it as we move forward, that we need to continue to be talking to one another and being in conversation, even in the worst of times, so we can make it much better when it will happen in much better times. So I am a professor of medieval Judaism and Islam, meaning I was trained as a rabbi and an academic in Jewish studies, and I have a doctorate in Arabic and Islamic studies. And the reason I got involved in this kind of interesting nexus of relationship is because of the experience I had as a young man in meeting Arab Muslim friends and being so just very enamored with the culture and the history and the tradition of Islam as a Jew. And that has sort of brought me into learning more and wanting to learn more about the tradition. So I come to my Jewish studies in a way in relation to my Islamic studies. That is, I use the same methodology when I'm studying issues in both of our communities. And that's not always done because people tend to privilege their own tradition above the tradition of the other, and makes it a kind of, I could say it's an interesting endeavor when one is employing the same kind of methodology when looking at the self and looking at the other. So that's where I'm coming from. And maybe Mehnaz has a few words to say about where she's coming from, and then we can begin looking at some of the texts that we're considering today.
Well, I mean, first, I just want to say welcome, everyone. Assalamu alaikum and shalom and peace be upon you. I want to mention that Ruven and I have been friends for a very long time. I used to live in Los Angeles, and I was at Loyola Marymount University, and I've had Shabbat at his house. He knows my family. I know his family. So it's funny that this all came about in terms of doing something with Reuven, and I have immense deep respect for his work, especially in terms of the Quran and what he can do with that, and how he can explain that in terms of looking at whether this is Islamophobic or not, and how much he does really have the historical context and understanding and the setting of the time of Prophet Muhammad, but also the different kinds of interpretation that go along with it. So I want to say couple of things. So I really teach pretty much contemporary stuff. So I do, like I'm doing a course right now called Muslims in the Holocaust, which is very popular, as you can imagine. And I'm doing a course on women in Islam, which is also very popular right now. And we are doing units on Iran, Afghanistan, and we're looking at the Quran all the time in terms of women's rights. In my class on Muslims in the Holocaust, I first start talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the connections that the three traditions have had with each other, but also the connections that fall into what we call the Middle East today. We talk about Egypt, we talk about Zion, what that means, and Israel. So I try to sort of look at these traditions for what they are. And I think this is what Reuven is saying when he says that it's important to understand these traditions that are outside of your own faith, right? So, for example, teaching something like Judaism or Christianity for myself is actually a complete utmost pleasure, because then I get to read sacred texts that are not mine. And sometimes I'm informed more about the Quran and how I approach the Quran in understanding those texts, whether it's about Egypt or whether it's about the whole story of the Exodus, which is actually one of my PhD areas when I was a PhD student. And then, of course, I also did my work in 19th and 20th German philosophy and looked at the Holocaust deeply, and also other genocides, as I teach religion and genocide and religion and Holocaust as well. So I wanted to begin with that. And I just want to say that, interpretation and what we're talking about in terms of misuse of text is clearly about tafsir, right? Interpretation, ijtihad, coming to a consensus of some sort. But for me personally, as a Muslim, every Ramadan, reading the Quran shows me something completely different. Scholarship or no scholarship. So one of the things that I want us to think about is, well, once we read a text or a paragraph or a surah, in the case of Quran, it's not over. It's not as if we have actually mastered something. And I think this is the challenge of all religious texts, that we have this continual sort of way of looking at text, interpreting text, looking at it historically. And therefore, when I begin my classes, I say, look, the rhetoric that comes from these texts that people, human beings use, not God, God doesn't fall down from the sky, becomes this rhetoric which is kind of anti-other, right? Anti-Jew, anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, anti-Buddhist, we can go on down the list. And what we try to do, I think, and what we want to do, I think, as human beings, in terms of whatever, regardless of what your faith base is to take a message of what we think the Quran has said to us, what we perhaps can surmise of a certain historical situation. And I think that is extremely important. So it's not simple. It's not an absolute truth. And it's not going to clarify things, perhaps. Perhaps Reuven and I will sit here and complexify more for you than what you want. But these are ways that we interpret. This is definitely my interpretation personally. I don't stand here for all Muslims in the world. And I hope that, we can have a conversation and dialogue about how this kind of texts, our sacred texts, are used rhetorically for the purposes of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And I think that's very, very important for us. Reuven.
Okay, so we're going to take a look at a very difficult text in my tradition, and then we're going to look at a happier text in my tradition. So let's take a look at the first text that we chose, which is from Deuteronomy chapter 7, will be on the board. And I'm going to work on the English. I hope that you can see it well enough. When the Lord your God, this is in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the first 5 books of Moses in the Torah. It's one of the most sacred, it is the most sacred collection of books in the Hebrew Bible. And yeah, so now you can see it here. I have the Hebrew as well to look at if we want to, but this is better because you can all see it now. So let's just read it. And I'm going to read through it and stop. But there's a lot of text here. Let's just go through it and take notes if you want. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, there are a lot of questions that come up. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, these are 7 Canaanite nations, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. For that would turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. Then it goes on to say what has to be done. A lot, so that you destroy their religious shrines and all that sort of thing. And then in verse 7, it says, and it was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his heart on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors, that the Lord had brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know, therefore, that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who maintains covenant loyalty with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and who repays in their own person those who reject him. He does not delay, but repays in their own person. That really means is going to do as bad to you as you are to be doing to the enemies of God, that is, to those who reject him. So therefore, observe diligently the commandment, the statutes and ordinances that I'm commanding you today. Okay, so this is a tough text. I'd like to move it back to the beginning, because this is talking about what is called a cherem. Cherem means absolute, total, and complete destruction. It says you must totally destroy them, make no covenant with them, and show them no mercy. That's a problem. It's a big problem. And for many Jews today, it doesn't make sense. Interestingly enough, scholars and careful readers have noticed the following line that says, make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. There is a kind of rationalization that some people have made with regard to this text. It was written, according to biblical scholarship, in the 7th century, 300 years after the purported conquest of the land of Canaan. And it seems to be a text that isn't actually a historical text giving orders, commands of God before entering the land, but is more of a text saying, well, we live in this land and there are lots of people here. This is a multicultural land that you're living in. The 7 Canaanite nations were never defeated. They're still living in the land of what Jews call the land of Israel. And God seems to be saying to the people here, well, if you would have paid attention, there would be no more Canaanites around. They would all be gone. But they're all here, so make sure that you don't interact with them too much. You don't intermarry with them and lose your identity as Jews. Now, one other kind of rationalizing subtext I need to tell you is that in the ancient world, religion was a matter of being associated and loyal to a particular god. There were many gods in the world. The Israelites had their God. The Jebusites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, they all had their own gods. And if you engage in kind of social engagement with other peoples, you're going to be inevitably engaged in some kind of activity that's going to be understood as acknowledging their gods. The only God in the world in those days that was considered a universal God was the God of Israel. And so associating with various other communities that worshiped other gods was a dangerous thing, because it meant acknowledging other deities in the world rather than the unified God of all, which was only understood in those days among the Israelite people. So that's a kind of an excuse, and it's probably true historically, but you still have this on the books. That is, you have a divine command of destroying other communities that are living in your land. And some people to this day take this very seriously. And it becomes a problem, and it becomes incumbent upon us as Jews to make sure that other people in our own community understand the meaning of these texts and do not become kind of radicalized by them. I'm now speaking as a Jew. Manaz will come in and tell us something about how these texts are used to kind of otherize, if you will, Jewish communities by other communities of people. So Manaz, I wonder if you would like to kind of step in at this point.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, this is interesting, right? Because we're talking about, you know, a piece of land. We're talking about sacred land. We're talking about people. We're talking about this destruction, this idea of purity and belonging, right? And also one of the things I think that becomes problematic, and I've done this in many sessions on interreligious training, is this idea of the chosenness, right? I mean, this becomes sort of problematic. But in the Quran too, we have this proclamation when God says to the Muslims, right? At that time, there was no Islam or Muslims, but we assume that God is talking to us, is that we have chosen you because the ones that we chose before you were completely inept. They didn't get the message, right? And so therefore you are to now carry this covenant with God forward. So I think that there is this sort of hierarchical chronology in these traditions, especially when you look at Judaism and Islam and look at Christianity coming in between. But you also have this idea that somehow there was this initial truth and this word that was given, which is accepted in Islam, rejected really in Christianity in a way. But at the same time, that somehow God has spoken already, and that people did not really comprehend what was going on. And then he says, the peoples on earth to be his people, his treasured possession. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with Muslims that are very upset about this idea of this treasured possession, or these people that are very few, but they are chosen to kind of purify land and renew basically a covenant, because God is saying, do not make any covenant with them because they will have no mercy with you. Now, in my text, I don't want to move you forward because I know you have more to go. I'll show you something that's related to this Deuteronomy 7. Okay. Reuven, do you want to go to your...
Oh, are we going to your text, or are we going to go to the second Deuteronomy text?
No, to your
okay,
to your text.
Okay, so
your text.
So this is the complexity of what Scripture is all about. Scripture doesn't ever have a single message about an issue. It tends to have a range of messages about issues. So we have to kind of think about that Deuteronomy 7 text that seems to be so exclusive and uncaring about anyone else. And we have to kind of measure it up against another text in Deuteronomy. So let's take a look at Deuteronomy 10. So now this is God speaking. So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord and his decrees that I'm commanding you today for your own well-being. Although heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth is all that is in it, with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your ancestors alone and chose you, their descendants after them, out of all the peoples as it is today. I want to interject again. Remember that in the context in which this was originally conceived, every community had its own deity. There was no sense of universal God at the time. So the God of Israel chose Israel. The God of Canaan chose the Canaanites. The God of Moab chose the Moabites. And everyone had their own kind of exclusive relationship with their gods. For some reason, which researchers do not know, the community of Israel made a transition over a period of 100 or more years from thinking that the God of Israel was only the God of Israel to understanding the God of Israel as the God of all humanity. That then shook everything up because that exclusivity that was ancient and partly and embedded in an ancient tradition had to kind of be re-understood and reworked in a way that would make room for everyone else. And so here, as we continue, we will see how God now sort of extends the reach or the concern that Israel should have, not only for their own community and for God, but for others as well. So in 16 and further, let's see, it says, circumcise then the foreskin of your heart. That means kind of, be humble and do not be stubborn any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the stranger. The stranger is the ger. That's not an Israelite. That's a non-Israelite who's living in the community. God, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the stranger, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And a lot of people have remarked in the last year or two that this commandment to love the stranger occurs 36 times in the Torah. It's the commandment that occurs more often than any other commandment. So it's quite significant. And we have to think about this in relation to the earlier or the kind of more basic command of exclusivity. And this is part of the tension that all of our monotheist traditions have, kind of looking inward, concern for the community of believers on the one hand, and the responsibility also to look outward and to be concerned for the humanity at large. So I'll leave it at that, and let's move on, Mehnaz.
Riven, I want to ask you a question before we move on, just quickly. So I think this in 17, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe. How do you think of that?
There is a kind of an assumption that in the ancient days, the relationship between the gods and their people was similar to that between, let's say, a farmer and his sheep. It was a kind of symbiotic relationship. The gods were not all powerful. If you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, you see the gods made a big mistake and they made it impossible for people to make offerings to them, and then they started starving. And so when the people started making offerings again to the gods, they swarmed around the offerings like flies because they were so hungry. So this is kind of this kind of image, and this seems to be what people really thought. We humans feed the gods, and the gods take care of us so that we can produce goods to feed the gods with. This is a kind of symbiotic relationship. When Israel made that transition from polytheism, or from unitheism, if you will, to real monotheism, it understood that there's a God that's a creator God of the universe. Which God would be that God? It would be natural for a community to think their own God was the God that was the creator of the world, right? And so the God of Israel, which at one time was a God of only a community of people, became understood as the God of the entire universe, the creator God of everyone. And then there's this eternal problem that has forever plagued the Jewish people, and that is we still have the remnants of that early tradition where the God of Israel is only the God of Israel, and yet the God of Israel is the God of everyone. So how do we balance that relationship between special relationship with God as God's people and being just one of many peoples on earth? And we can see many verses in the Torah and in the Bible throughout that kind of struggle with this question. So that's kind of how I read that. It's a struggle.
Okay, thank you. We can go to my slide. So mine's a little shorter.
Is it this one
Yeah,
that you're starting with, or the next one? This one.
this one, right. So, can you make it a little smaller? So I just want to make, yeah. Anyway, so when the reason I chose 9:5, and there's a couple of reasons for this, and it's the most cited verse by Islamophobes, and I'm not kidding, right? So you have people like Spencer, Pamela Geller, and others are constantly talking about this. If you Google this verse, you will see how many people will say that this is what the basis of all Muslims and what they think. And I think it's important for us to look at this, right? And kind of ask ourselves, like, well, why is this verse constantly mentioned, right? Why is it always picked up by people who want to say that Islam is a religion of violence, that this verse is put out, and it is used by people to talk about Islam as a violent religion? Now, this verse is actually the verse of the sword. It's a verse that is important, I think, to the idea of both diversity and singularity. It's also important in terms of the context of what Ruven was saying about God and gods. The idea of the monotheistic God, the one God, the all-encompassing, unknowing God. And it's also very important in terms of sacred land, in terms of the haram. Haram typically means forbidden, but it also means the land of the Arabian Peninsula. So let's read the verse. So once the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists who violated their treaties. Wherever you find them, capture them, besiege them, lie in wait for them on every way. But if they repent, perform prayers, and pay alms tax, then set them free. Indeed, Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. So some people have translated kill the polytheists as kill the infidels, and we could have a long conversation about what that means in Islam. And some people have said that this just basically says that you are allowed, in fact, to kill people on the basis of Quranic thought, right? And there are many, many other verses that I could have gone to, but this one, because it's used most commonly, is important for me to explain. So this verse comes, after the conquest of Mecca, of Muhammad. And these sacred months are basically 4 months that are to be given to people who were worshiping other gods and goddesses. As you will recall, Islam came at a time where there were a lot of idol worship. This is a verse that really is telling you not to worship idols. And it's also a verse that is saying that you are giving time to people, these 4 months, before you can capture them or besiege them or lie in wait of them, or not at all kind of, very violent kind of feeling about this notion of the other. But it says that if they repent, perform prayers, and pay alms tax, then set them free. Indeed, Allah is all forgiving and most merciful. So one of the most important things I think for us to understand is that adultery will not be tolerated in the Arabian Peninsula. It's also really interesting that this verse comes and is giving time to people. And if we were to read on, it actually says, do not kill them, but give them the time to kind of understand what Islam is. If they understand what Islam is and they accept Islam, let them be. If not, let them go freely. So it's a very confusing verse, but it's also a verse that is important in terms of establishing Mecca and Medina in the Arabian Peninsula, and also establishing the same kind of rule that Judaism comes with, that thou shalt not commit adultery in any form. And this verse becomes problematic in many circles, but it's also a verse that doesn't have a context, and you're not reading the whole surah through. I also want to say that if you look at the history of Islam, there were many places, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, the Mughals, that had people who were polytheists living with them, the Mughals especially with Hindus. So people were protected. It was particularly about the Arabian Peninsula where you find this kind of conditionality of this non-believer that is amidst you and upon this land. So the land of Haram becomes the most important sacred land for Muslims at that time. And I want to go back to Ravenna a little bit because it's almost kind of similar to Deuteronomy 7, where you're being told that you are the ones to spread Islam and give people time to do that. And if they do not do that, then you have to tell them to leave, right? That's the resort. But even to capture them and besiege them and then make sure that they're nowhere to be seen in this peninsula is also very interesting. I don't know, Riven, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting verse because it's followed by a verse that almost looks as if it's contradicting it. It says in the following verse, which I don't think we have here, it says in verse 9:6, it says, but if one of those idolaters seeks protection from you, and the word is really interesting, it's istijaraka, and a jar is also a neighbor, so seeks to kind of be your neighbor with you, then grant him protection until he hears the word of God, and then make him, then allow him or enable him to attain a place of safety. This is because there are people who just don't know. So it's
have no knowledge, right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating juxtaposition. On the one hand, it looks like it says here, once the sacred months have passed, kill all those polytheists. But then what if one of those polytheists says, I really want protection because I need to live here? Well, then you're obligated to give them protection. You're supposed to teach them, do a little missionizing, but it doesn't say force them, it doesn't say kill them, right? And then help them find a place of safety. So and that's the next verse. So when you read these verses one at a time, and you have to read them out of context. There's no way you can read them within context because context is really complicated, and it defeats the purpose of polemics and trying to discredit a community of people, and that unfortunately is the goal, right?
And that's why I chose the next verse, if we can go there, which is one of my favorite verses, but also in interfaith work, I know that a lot of people use this. But, I think this idea of difference is really important, right? I mean, we're we experience Islamophobia or anti-Semitism in terms of, really abrogating these verses, taking them out of context and using them. And we have these problems in the Muslim world. So there are many groups that will use these verses to justify the killing of the other. That's just the honest truth. And that's a reality. And we have seen this over and over again. And as Muslims who are trying to teach Islam, or trying to look at it historically, we have to be very aware and self-critical of what's going on in the dissemination of these texts and how these texts are being used and in what context, right? I remember after 9/11 teaching Islam and looking at Osama bin Laden's transcripts that, by the way, are available on Google. You can read what he's writing, how he's justifying things. And I went through those with my students because I think that's important to understand what is going on in these pockets of community that will take this and literalize it and use it against the other, whether there are Jews or Christians or Hindus or whatever. So that's why I think it's important to understand that as a Muslim, you have to take responsibility of what your text says. You have to have the argument and you have to understand the context of not just your tradition, but other traditions. So this verse 5:4-8 is about the revelation to the prophet, this book with the truth as a confirmation of previous scriptures, a supreme authority on them. So judge between them by what Allah has revealed and do not follow their desires over the truth that has come to you. To each of you, we have ordained a code of law and a way of life. If Allah had willed, he would have made you one community, but his will is to test you with what he has given each of you to compete with one another in doing good. In doing good. To Allah, you will all return. Then he will inform you of the truth regarding your differences. So life is a challenge. It's a test, right? I mean, if we are Muslims and Jews, we believe the power of God, but we don't really understand the power of God. But God is saying, I am challenging you with giving different messages and making people different from you in order for you to really live your life by doing good with one another. And that to Allah, we all return and he will inform you of the truth, right? Nobody else is going to inform us. And so therefore this becomes tricky, right? How do you teach this to children? How do you teach this in groups of communities without this context, right? So if you take the Quran all together, but if you take your whole Quran as a basis of understanding and interpreting and saying that it is about peace, it's about submission to God. But what kind of submission is God asking you for? God is saying, I have created this world with differences, with complexity, with terror, with fear, with tragedy, with happiness. And all of those things are mentioned over and over in the Quran. And that's why I think this verse kind of contradicts this idea of infidels or translated infidels or even people who are quote unquote polytheists. It kind of makes you think, well, that is also a creation of God, right? And I must challenge myself by doing good with these people rather than killing them or converting them forcefully. So these are the issues I think that are really, really, really important for us to think of. And then also the history of Islam. No, the golden age wasn't this pure time for Jews and Christians under the Islamic empires, but they were permitted to live there with the jizya tax. There were, of course, incidences between human beings of hatred and a misunderstanding. There were attacks. But on the whole, there was this understanding that you have to accept, the Yahud, the Nasara, the Majus, who were the Zoroastrians, right? This is before you even had the Persian Empire. You had the Sassanian Empire. So when we look at our texts, we have to understand context and then try really hard to understand what's going on, because you know what? we are not God. And that is exactly the humility that these texts come with, because they're pushing us and pressing us to think about, what should I do next? How should I react to my brother or my sister? And that's what I think is so interesting about reading sacred text.
Thank
So I
you.
guess I guess what we haven't really talked about is how we've sort of assumed it, and is how people use these texts as ammunition to discredit and to demean and to dehumanize another community. But I think we've said enough so that it can be imagined. That is, you take a single verse, or you cherry pick a series of verses that conform to the message you want to convey, and you use those, and you say that's what this religion is all about, instead of taking a holistic view and seeing how complex a religious community and a religious tradition is. Religions usually do not have a single position on most things. They're usually a range of positions. And within the monotheistic traditions, I think it's fair to say, all of us, we have vectors of thinking within our traditions that are very inward looking and are intended to protect and nurture the community and to not be so concerned with the outside. We need to concentrate on us. We need to nurture ourselves at this moment. And then there are other texts within our tradition, both from scripture and its interpretation and in our tradition literature, that are very outward looking and express a deep and abiding concern for the welfare of all humanity. And, you know, those of us who are in the tradition and really know it well, we understand that tension, very much like the tension that we have as individuals between our need to feel that we're a special group of people and that need to be a part of a much larger world around us. And so it's the same story about taking things out of context and showing how taking a piece of a complicated idea or a complicated reality and weaponizing it is so much to the detriment. That's not only done by outsiders who negate the community, but it's also done by insiders to use them as tools against the outside. So people can take these texts that are violent, angry texts in our tradition and use them to justify violent and angry behavior directed to others. And so as religious people, I feel that we need to work mostly with our own communities to help our own communities understand that that's a no-go, right? So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth on this, probably more than 2 cents.
We have a couple of questions that are coming in at the moment, so we're just going to sift through them. Thank you both once again for sharing your thoughts with very, particular selected texts. Of course, there are probably an umpteen number of additional texts, not only from sort of the scriptures themselves, but from ancillary religious texts that are held in high regard in shaping or forming the traditions of Islam and Judaism as they have come to be over the centuries. And obviously, even within those traditions, there is a fair amount of diversity in terms of what kinds of ideas and interpretive modes might be emphasized over others. So we nonetheless appreciate you're giving us a little bit of an insight into the process of how these texts sit within their locations in the scripture, what circumstances might have prompted their placement or positioning from the authors of these texts. Of course, in the Islamic tradition, with respect to the Quran, that authorship is ascribed to God. And then within the other ancillary texts, there's a tradition of scholarship in both of these religious traditions that is centuries long and intertextual and quite significant. So we appreciate just getting a sense of how seriously we have to consider how these texts are employed in human life, and recognizing that those kinds of decisions inevitably, are limit in some ways the text and their original intent or context. Andrea, I don't know if you've had a chance to sift through
Yeah.
the questions.
So I'm going to give two questions because I think they're connected. And then there's a third question I think would be really good if we can get to that. So first question, assuming it is impossible to prevent bad, wrong, or destructive interpretations of sacred texts, whichever the tradition, it seems that the question becomes about creating a normative discourse, a social or political consensus around what is a better interpretation, which is obviously no small task. Is there a different way to handle destructive interpretations of text? I'm rephrasing that a little. And then there were two together. In the holy text shared by both Professor Rouvain and Professor Afridi, taking the text out of context brings clarity, but also they recommend keeping them in the historical context. Can we reconcile religious texts revealed in specific time periods when they're misused in our own context?
I can respond to the first question a little bit. I mean, that's a hard question because, like I said, I began with saying that, this is my interpretation. But, if you're, it's important to put, allow, say, like, first of all, you have to educate people. That's number one, right? You have to teach them how to read, but not just read, but also interpret and know the history. And most people don't have that time, right? And that's something I know very well as somebody who does academia and also directs the center. But I do want to say that there should be a social kind of fabric of of say a Muslim society, or say in this case a Jewish society, that has the element of what are we about as a community? Are we about violence? Are we about conquering the other? Or are we about peace and humility, right? And sacrifice for community outside of ours? So is it, we have to make that sort of the tenor of where we live and what community we are from, whether it's a mosque community, an Islamic community, whether it's in your own house, whether it's with your community of friends, whether it's in a synagogue. I mean, this is really, really important, because if you are just getting these literal verses plucked out of the Quran or the Torah, then of course you're going to be kind of constructed by that. So I say educate yourself, and then question a leader who is saying we must kill so and so, or we must get rid of so and so, because is that really where you want to be? And if you don't want to be somewhere and you're uncomfortable with it, then take it upon yourself to learn these texts and to learn what your text is saying. And that's sort of like the very complicated, simple answer I can give.
Yeah, I certainly don't disagree with that. I would add another angle on this, and that is that if you look at the commentary tradition in Judaism or Islam and Islam, you'll see that nobody agreed about the meaning of the texts. There were always disagreements, and that's the reason we have these huge libraries of tafsir and perush commentaries in Islam and Judaism, because people did not agree with one another. There is no way we're going to get, we have this joke, there are two Jews in the room and they have three opinions, but That's exactly the same with my Muslim friends. When there are two Muslims in a room, there are also three opinions, and two Christians in a room, there are also three opinions. That's just the way it happens. That's because we're people. Um, Maybe we Jews get off on that. We think that's a funny thing, but in any event, it's part of human life. And so our scripture is an open access document. Everyone has access to it. Everyone can look at it, and everyone has a right to their own opinion. It's unfortunate that some people look at this material with certain agendas that make it problematic and difficult, but we can't prevent people from doing that. In the final analysis, I was going to say it's a free country, it's a free world. Well, it's really not a free country, and it's really not a free world. There are all kinds of restrictions. But humans are free to look at something and have their own opinion. And so the bottom line is that is people who are gracious and loving and accepting and interested in reaching out to other human beings and loving them and being a part of their life and wanting them to be a part of our life. We need to, as much as possible, to control the discourse over how these verses are interpreted. And there's no way around it. There's no way we're going to like resolve the problem, because people will go to school and they'll learn our methodology and our approach to life. And people will go to other schools and they'll learn a whole different approach and different methodology to life. And we have to acknowledge the fact that that's the way the world works. We have to do our best to promote our values in the world. And where we can find coalitions with people of like-mindedness in other religious traditions, that is so important. That is really important for all of us. So that would be my recommendation.
What was the second one? I'm sorry, Andrea. It was a long one.
Yeah, I think it was not so dissimilar, which is like why I put them together. It was really about the historical context. But I think a lot of what, how do you presented the historical context, each of you, to the original verses, which are taken out of context to put our communities in a bad light, or sometimes used internally within our communities to promote violence. Both can be the case, which I think, I heard each of you say in a way. So the question was about how do we keep that historical context? And I'm not sure that it's so that the answer would be different than this issue of like really putting our values forward and forging connections with like values. But I'm wondering if there's more you want to say about that.
Well, I mean, I think historical context it's hard to teach because there are a lot of very bad things that religions did and are doing, and there are very good things that they did and are doing, right? So when you have like something like the golden age of Spain, or the way that how wonderful, I mean, there's sort of kind of nostalgia that goes on historically with each tradition. But I can speak as a Muslim that kind of wants to say, look how nice we were to people and how nice we were as an empire. But that's really not true. So that gives us historical context, right? In that way. Now, in terms of the Quran, also, like the idea that somehow it was revealed and it was just put together is another thing that is a societal error in terms of Muslim communities. Then the fact that there are many, many ways that the Hadith, with all its writers, influenced many of the schools, Islamic schools, in terms of thinking about Islam and how to think about the Quran, right? And a lot of those kind of ways really didn't give a historical cultural context, but just literal sort of little rules and regulations that kind of modeled the understanding that Islam actually has a history and that it changed with history. And the Quran itself is immutable. I understand that as a Muslim, but we are not, right? Human beings are not. We are always changing and transforming, and we are not perfect. But each time historical period, as we move through interpretation of Quran or Islam, there has been change, transformation, different interpretations have been given more value than others. And that's what historical context is to me.
I just want to add one thing, if I may. I want to take issue with one thing that Manaz said, but not what she thinks, because I know what she thinks. But at one point, I think she said early on in this discussion that there was a good time, there's an image of what life was like under Muslim rule in Spain, and in this period of time, there was a kind of a golden age, and it was really good. And then she said, well, it really wasn't like that. I just don't want people in the audience to misunderstand. I don't think she meant it didn't happen at all. In fact, I think, knowing Manaz, I think what she intended by that was that, whenever anyone is in control of power, it's abused by certain people, and in other times it's not abused by people. So the so-called golden age was indeed a much better situation that, say, that Jews and other minorities had under Islam, minorities had in other places, but it wasn't hunky-dory. It wasn't just all so wonderful, because there's never a time when that is, like the kind of Jewish longing for the nostalgia in the olden days when we lived in the shtetl in Eastern Europe, when we sang Fiddler on the Roof and, all that. Well, there were a lot of pogroms at that time too. So nostalgia, you're anti-nostalgia, but the reality was it wasn't so bad, even though it wasn't perfect. Yeah.
No, it was no. I've argued that in my work in terms of Muslim empires and the kind of relationship that went on in terms of Muslims, Jews, and Christians in terms of power. The one thing we haven't really talked about, and I'm not going to talk about it, but I just want people to think about, is Christianity. And the violence that came with too against Jews and Muslims both. And also, just to leave you with this note on the Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that is really on the utmost high right now in the United States, is also coming from most white Americans, especially the violent acts against, like, say, synagogues and mosques and other places. So we are missing our third partner here in this conversation. I just wanted to leave it there because I don't think they should not be part of this conversation. It's very, very important.
Thank you so much, Manaz, both of you, for that really important historical context. And I want to pick up on a word I heard 3 times. I heard Ruvain say it once, and I heard Manaz say it twice. And that word is humility. And I think that there's a tremendous, and I think this fits in with kind of Christians in the background too, that it's when religion is approached from a place of arrogance that we often find that there's more violence expressed, whether the arrogance is coming from the group that, that's being that's the target, or the group that is outside doing the targeting. And this idea of humility, I think, is really important as we invite our students in. We're really grateful, and in a moment, Munir will introduce our students, and we'll bring them on, and we're going to just thank Ruvain and Manaz so much for just being here with us, and for your wealth of both of knowledge and heart in this work. We're so grateful for what you do and what you do together and what you did together here. And we're going to ask you to stay on. Yeah, we're going to ask you to kind of to stay behind the scenes just in case there's some other things that come up. But I want to talk about humility once again, as I talk about making sure that as we're talking with one another, we're remembering that we want to be assuming good intentions. We're remembering that we want to speak just for ourselves. We want to note when we feel discomfort, and the discomfort may be there, and to remember to take a breath and speak from your own experience. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Munir to introduce our students, for whom we're really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, so we have a number of students with us from a Jewish and Muslim graduate school seminary context, and we're very grateful for their participation, and looking forward to hearing their reactions to Dr. Firestone and Dr. Afridi. We have with us from the Ziegler School of Rabbinics, Lily Gross and Sean Weiss. And we have from Bayan Islamic Graduate School, Heather El Sayed and Maher Hussein. Hopefully they can turn on their cameras and we'll be able to hear them. But we'll just go through a couple of questions with each of them. I think we can get started with the first question. So essentially, as you were listening to our two scholars, was there anything in particular that resonated with you? What was your kind of initial reaction, or what stuck with you in either or both of their comments? Perhaps we can just cycle through. I'll just call some names and ask Andre to help me as we proceed through this process. But
Yeah, and I'll just want to remind us, what we'd love to do is hear from each of you about 1.5 minutes on what really resonated with you. And so when I've got my little timer here and when it's starting to wrap up, you'll just see me kind of put my hand up here. And that's your invitation to complete the thought that you're on. And I'm going to go alphabetically, which means I think we'd like to hear from Heather first. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me and for this fruitful discussion. I truly appreciate being here. There were a few things that stood out to me. Number one, I did want to just make a note that whenever Professor Afridi was talking and Professor Rubin actually answered, and he said he realized that linguistically, the way that the word had been translated into English actually mistranslated what that verse meant. And so just being here as an observer and really understanding as a student, we're more moving towards a new comparative theology, having that awareness that even in the interacting with text, that we may have a limitation on what that text means is so important. And also being able to call it out as well was very important, I feel, to also say, wait a minute, there's actually more meaning behind how this Arabic word really means, and it changed the whole meaning. And so just being mindful when we're interacting with text, that's one thing that stood out to me. And the other thing that really stood out to me is that when they were talking about how there's kind of this, we started talking about more of like the Middle Ages and things like that, the proving of religious superiority and having that humility is important. And I feel like in the work that I'm doing, at least, we're moving from that old comparative theology to the new comparative theology. And so it was a blessing to see them both interacting in that realm of new comparative theology, where we're being respectful and interacting, but listening with our ears, not with our own opinions. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Lily, I think you're up next.
Hey, everybody. My name is Lily Gross. I want to echo what Heather just said about kind of translation and the power of translation. As I've begun my studies and learned more about kind of how to interpret and read Hebrew text from a kind of perspective of really understanding the roots and how all of it fits together, it's really important to think about how other religions have done that throughout time as well. And I'm really inspired to maybe get into deeper conversation with people who have this historical translation experience with the Quran and understanding some of those pieces as I explore our texts as well. But I think the piece that has been really important for me as well has been this idea of contextualization, both historic and in the text itself, like what was happening in the arc line of the stories, but also what was happening to our peoples as these things were written, and how can we maybe actually shift that to sit with these verses that might feel uncomfortable with that idea of contextualization? How can we look at a text that feels like, ooh, is that really what our people believe, with the historic knowledge? And does it fit differently today? And how can we sit with those things in the idea of context?
Thank you so much, Lily. Mahir, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Mahir, yes, yeah, Mahir. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to, give my appreciation. Thanks for having me. I really do appreciate the nature of the subject matter today. I think it's really crucial. I think, misinterpretation, misuse of sacred texts have led to, bigoted justifications for prejudice and violence. So the fact that, and it's had, so many harmful consequences, in both Islam and Judaism towards our faiths and people who practice our faiths. Something that really jumped out to me, and I really did appreciate what Sister Mehnaz talking about the verse in Surah Toba, verse number 5, which is quoted as the sword, the verse of the sword. And just to kind of add a little bit onto that, Islamophobes like to jump on that verse without considering, its historical and situational context, right? Reading the verse before that or after, um, you know, not just, the hatred and the refusal to understand, a person, their background, what they follow, especially in this particular context, completely ignoring historical, cultural context and copying and pasting, how we look and live and are today to, back then. And then, ignoring the fact that there were, previously violated treaties, and the Muslims were dealing with, war and dealing with warring tribes and factions. And so that's just something that I wanted to just kind of bring up and wanted to appreciate and just kind of highlight the dangers. I mean, social media, I think, presents itself as, a platform of hate. And, so I just wanted to, I'm sorry for ranting, but
That's okay. Is that bringing social media in, I think, is really important. That's a place where things grow in ways that can be very dangerous for all of us. Thank you so much, Mahir. And Sean, we'd love to hear you bring it home.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Sean Weiss from Ziegler. Well, one thing that I kept thinking about listening to the scholars, it seems I kept thinking about our just contemporary secular culture, which is largely, I'm just speaking about America, it's largely theologically illiterate. There's sort of no general understanding of what theology is in one direction or another. It doesn't even matter what tradition you're talking about. There's just zero theological literacy, and it seems to me that that is sort of a problem for all of us. I don't know how you get from A to B in terms of beginning to educate. I know the scholars talked about the need for education, and I couldn't agree with that more. That is a daunting problem, and I don't even I really don't know where you begin with that, because it does seem to me, in order to even begin to have a more complicated kind of culture-wide conversation about what are really complex ideas and formulations and histories, et cetera, there's got to be some kind of baseline of education. And it just seems to me, in the US, at least right now, we're not even close to being able to have that.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much,
Thank
Sean.
you. Yeah, that's why we really appreciate the different perspectives and what you're adding, all four of you, to just broaden our reflections on these issues. There's so many interconnected components that I think just remind us that if we want to be serious people, we have to really account for these factors, and knowing that we're not going to be comprehensive necessarily, but that the picture is always more involved than we might find, especially as Maher pointed out, on social media or other contexts where information is provided to us in very bite-sized fashion for very particular reasons. So being able to take a step back, benefiting from sort of this, approach of curiosity and openness to filling in as many pieces of the puzzle as we can in our own lives so that we can move forward and try to develop meaningful relationships with one another. I think that's sort of what it all comes down to. But want to do one more round at least with you four. So you commented on things that resonated with you. How about anything that you might have heard that was a little bit difficult to hear? or something that might have prompted a new thought that you had not kind of known about before and you heard them speak about, but something a little bit new. I think we can maybe go through the same, or we can do in reverse order since Sean is on screen right now. Why don't we do that?
Okay. Just off the top of my head, it's not that I felt like I heard anything difficult in there. It's that I don't I think I heard or felt perhaps an expectation of everything should be smooth and peaceful and everything's okay and everyone in theory I share the desire, to live in peace and harmony and to have everything be, totally cool between all the peoples of the earth and so forth. I'm also aware of reality and history, and history tells me otherwise. Reality tells me otherwise. I don't know, and I don't want to sound like a crazy person, but the expectation for everything to be understood and everything to fit together nicely and to kind of feel good about everything. When I read the Torah, I don't expect to be unbothered by my reading experience. I mean, I assume that I am going to be reading things that are jagged and impossible to deal with. And I'm really okay with that. And when I look at other traditions, I'm okay. That's what I expect. I expect no less than that. And so whereas the expectation of the smoothness and the everything sort of good, quite frankly, that makes me more uneasy than the alternative.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that's an excellent insight, and I think a lot of us can appreciate that and think about that, from our own lens. I think you're right. It's as we were talking about sort of the historical utopian vision that sometimes some of us carry. At the same time, struggling with our text is going to be a permanent situation. So thank you for pointing that out. Let's move on to Maher. We'll go back in reverse order. So
Hello, everyone. Just to kind of bounce off of Sean's commentary, I kind of just wanted I spoke a little bit about the Islamic point of view earlier, and I just wanted to speak a little bit to the Jewish, the verse from the Torah from Deuteronomy. Again, to kind of bring up, geopolitical context, we again the harms of copying and pasting, you know what I mean, what our norms seem like, it's difficult to criticize the Jewish nation of that time for partaking and what is in here, it's in partaking in conquest, right, where all of these nations are doing similar, if not more active conquests and partaking in battles. I mean, you know earlier centuries and earlier times are riddled with conflict, battles. So why is it that the Abrahamic faiths are criticized when they themselves take it upon themselves to either protect or to advance, just like how other nations have been doing and currently are doing. So the fact that people look at Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 1 as, oh, the Jews are plucking out the indigenous peoples, clearing out, it's what I mean, it's hard to criticize them when why is it that the Abrahamic faiths have to be the only ones to wave white flags and sit quietly in their homes and pray and read from scripture, where they live in a society, they live in a world, we live in a world. So I just wanted to echo and kind of defend the Jewish points of view in that context. So
yeah, thank you. Thank you for that thought. I mean, it does raise the questions about, how do we strike a balance in a way in terms of, understanding these texts and what the rights are of different groups of people and how can we honor those rights, but also try to create security. So thank you. All right. We'll we'll invite Lily once again to say a few words and share with us your thoughts on this.
I think I'm often uncomfortable when calls for death come up in sacred text. It's not necessarily the thing that I'm looking for when I look for sacred text, and it shows up a lot. And so I guess I'm always surprised by my internal response more than anything, is like how uncomfortable it makes me feel to read these things that go hand in hand with where I get what I would say my values and my ethics from, that sit side by side, what can sometimes feel and look really uncomfortable. And so I think it's really important to sit in these conversations to contextualize them. Thank you so much for all the history and putting together, like, really, where did those calls come from, and what were the spaces that the Jews and Muslims were in that they needed that to feel secure and safe and to be part of their ethics at that time. And I guess what I'm really reflecting on is, how do we then take that and sit with it today, and use it and continue to use it when it makes me feel some type of way. So
Thank you.
that
I
is
mean, I
kind of-
think this harks back to Dr. Afridi's remarks earlier about, how do we want to be in relation to these texts, because they are multifaceted. It makes me think of the Quranic passage in the beginning of the Quran where the angels question God as to why God created a being that will cause bloodshed upon the earth. And, obviously we've seen that. So then it's like, well, yeah, why? Maybe the angels have a point. But God responds to the angels and says, well, I know better than you, or I know more than you. So it sort of indicates that, in the trajectory of our existence as human beings in this time that we're given, there will be some transformative moment. At least, if we take that passage from the Quran seriously, we don't know what it's going to look like, but God is saying that, he'll be proven right. So maybe we're all praying and hoping for that day that we will be able to transcend these the conflicts that are endemic to human experience and that are represented in some form or another in our sacred texts. All right, let's invite Heather, and we'll conclude this portion of the program.
I echo what Lily was saying about that uncomfortableness of violence in the religious texts, and how do you resolve that within? And I also wanted to talk about Professor Firestone, discussing Deuteronomy 10 and sharing. I'm just going to quote what I wrote, but the internal problem or a struggle that there's the remnants of God of Israel is God of Israel and yet God of the world. And I also started thinking about how do I can only speak for myself, but how do I interact with my own text, my own religious text, how am I showing up in my interfaith work, and what is my role? Because how am I using my text? Am I being inclusive or exclusive? Am I talking about God as though he's my God, or am I being more inclusive? And so I feel like I have a lot to work on as well, and understanding how to show up with my religious texts in my interfaith interactions. But I'm grateful for having the discussions from today to just kind of grapple with just things that I might have resonating within. And as Dr. Afridi had also said, checking in with yourself pretty much is what I think is what I hear echoing, is that humility that you have. Where do you stand? And educating yourself first.
Thank you. Andrea, yes.
Yeah, it was just that was perfect time, Heather. Thank you. And I just want to thank all of the students for just coming and sharing vulnerably and honestly from your spaces. We have just another couple of minutes left. Munir, do you want to kind of pull some things in from the first part, and then I'll bring it home?
Okay, sure. Yeah. I think you've heard a little bit of my commentary along the way, but I just wanted to make note of a few things that I heard from Dr. Firestone and Dr. Afridi. One of the things I appreciated in Rabbi Firestone's commentary was this idea in educating us about sort of the shifting notions about God's relationship with humanity, with the people of Israel, but then also with humanity. And I think that's an important dimension of religious literacy and understanding, the sort of impetus within the Jewish tradition to develop the notion of tikkun olam, for example, and other, similar ideas about, protecting the rights of others and looking for peace across humanity. So I want to thank Dr. Firestone for that bit of an enlightenment. With respect to Dr. Afridi's comments, one of the things that stood out to me, and I think this kind of broaches, the entire spectrum of the conversation, is that it's not only what the texts say, and there's a lot of discussion about the definitions of terms and the possible permutations of meaning of, based on the roots that the words are coming from. And that's, something that I think we've often understood, that words can be interpreted in various ways, or phrases can be interpreted. But so that's what's present in the text. But what's not present is also important. I think that's a big takeaway that I got from today's conversation, because there's the context that we've been talking about. And in that, there are certain assumptions that the initial audience for those texts might have had, right? The people who were with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, heard him say things, heard him recite the Quran, communicate the message. God is speaking, knowing that the people know certain things that don't have to be explicitly stated in the text. We don't benefit from that necessarily unless we look at the tradition and see what people have said about what might be the unstated portions of the message that is being delivered. So I want to thank Dr. Afridi for reminding us about that, such as, the idea that the sacred months are a particular time where, no violence should take place, and that people who are maybe not part of the community have an opportunity, they have time to sort of get to know the Muslim community, get to know the message, and, make some decisions about how they want to relate to the Muslim community in Arabia at that time. So thank you for that. And I think all of this kind of boils down to the idea of that we didn't explore in this gathering, but perhaps we can explore in a future one, is our respective religious traditions' notions of pluralism. And we got a little bit of that, an indication of that, but I think that can be explored in much greater detail, because there are many other texts and dimensions that can help us appreciate where our traditions actually call for us to build positive relations and live side by side with one another. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Munir. I feel like between our scholars and our student scholars, who, as Minaz noted, had just really beautiful insights, there was a tremendous amount about the tensions that we find ourselves in, all different kinds of tensions, which included the text that Ruvain and Minaz brought, the professors brought, which was the difficult text, and their favorite text, which was always very close, in both cases, very close to where that initial text was. And, I heard Sean also speak to this tension of, like, I'm not expecting that everything is going to be smooth. And Lily's acknowledging that when it's not smooth, there's sort of an internal struggle with that, right? That there are new ways of looking at things next to each other, I think, as Heather was indicating. And Mahir, I really appreciated your reflection both on the Muslim text and on the Jewish text. And in this way, I think we can continue in this place of understanding there will be tension, and there are also ways through the tension. Not always ways to harmonize, but ways that some of us can meet and dig together, and dig with curiosity. So one of the things that we didn't get to, one of the questions we didn't get to, is sort of, what else are you looking for as students in being able to kind of go out and make sure that these texts are being used in a way that will be healing more than destructive? And one of those things is, I think, to dig in and find out what the common values are, to get curious about what the common values are, and to ask questions when you hear people in your context misusing text against someone else, or when you hear people in another context, to kind of dig down and find out what's going on for them. That's what we do often at New Ground, is we think about what's the value that that person is trying to connect to, and how can I hear what's underneath the thing that rubs me the wrong way sometimes. And then how can I just keep learning, and hopefully you all will be doing some learning together, and maybe there'll be a part two. I just want to thank all of the speakers and all the panelists, Ruvain, and we want to thank Seema too before we go. Ruvain, yeah.
I just
Professor
want
Forrest.
to thank you all for enabling us to be a part of this program, and especially the students. I think it would be so cool. I mean, you have some wonderful students from Bayan and from Ziegler. Wouldn't it be great if you guys got together sometime and maybe the students at Bayan would do a kind of mini course or session on Quran for Jews, and invite the Ziegler students to come to Bayan, hopefully not in Chicago at the moment, but somehow in LA area, and vice versa, and do a thing together, and then bring a couple, other people who happen to be in the hallway at the time to come in and to be a part of it, and sort of subversive, get people together and learn from one another. That, I think, would be a lot of fun. Something I'd look forward to anyway. But I want to thank you all for being a part of this, and I have my agenda. I was very open about it, and thank everyone who attended, not only us 6 or 8 people, for attending as well. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It was really nice to have your contribution. I would just share a very brief prayer to conclude and close. Andrea, is there anything else that we should attend to?
I would offer a very short teaching once you're done, and I just want to make sure Seema, that we just thank Seema for convening us. It really was her vision, and if there's anything that she wants to add in before our closing prayer teachings, invite her to do that. She did that by text.
Wonderful. So I'll just share a very brief dua or supplication that Muslims use very commonly. And I think it's, very relevant to today's conversation. So I'll say it in Arabic and then I'll read the English translation. Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam tabarakta dhal wal ikram. That translates as, O God, you are peace. From you comes peace. To you returns peace. Revive us with the salutation of peace and lead us to your abode of peace.
Thank you. My go-to Jewish idea right now is from Rabbi Nachman, who's a Hasidic master, much more recent than the biblical text. And he says, Yesh inyan shehakol nehefach letova, im ata ma'amin sheyachol lekalkel, ta'amin sheyachol litaken, which means there's an idea that everything can turn the good. If you believe something can be destroyed, then also believe it can be repaired.
Beautiful. Thank you, everyone, for attending. May we see each other in the future in person or here online as we continue the conversation. Take care. Be well. Salam. Shalom. Salam.